You do not want to be on the building committee for the Antichrist. You don't want to support the cause. It may have to be built, that third temple in Jerusalem, but you don't want to be a part of it because it will belong to the Antichrist. We talked about that last week when I covered Saint Irenaeus from the 2nd century, who told us that that building will belong to the Antichrist and he will get people, most of your friends, your family, your lost loved ones, to worship him as a god there in that temple. You don't want to be on his team. But yet we see people being appointed to high places in government under the Donald Trump administration that seem to want to go all in to help rebuild that third temple. We should have caution there. Today I want to share with you some research done by Joshua Charles and the one-time Emperor Julian the Apostate put money and personnel behind rebuilding that temple, and how earthquakes, fireballs, and even the sign of the cross in the sky prevented them from doing so. It's kind of a big deal, and most people don't know about it. And I want to share that with you today on the Antichrist in our series. By the way, I'm Joe McClane. I host a radio program called The Catholic Take. I look at the headlines from a Catholic perspective. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested. But I've been doing a whole series on the Antichrist. Several videos. I've got a playlist. You should check it out so you can go back and watch it all. But today, Joshua Charles, fantastic biblical researcher. I included Joshua Charles in my documentary film on the end times. I'll link to that as well. You should check that out. Over on his blog, Eternal Christendom, he's got a wonderful article with the actual quotes and resources on what happened when Julian the Apostate, back in around 362, 363, tried to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Earthquakes, fireballs, people being charred to death, just like at Sodom and Gomorrah, and the sign of the cross in the sky. It was a big deal, and even pagans reference that. And I want to share just a couple of resources or a couple of references for you today. Again, you can read the entirety of Joshua's research in the link below. But this is a big deal because we have so many people today who think that in order to support the Jews, we have to help them rebuild that temple. This is wrong think. Listen, this is wrong think. We need to help the Jews by converting them into the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which is the new Israel, which is the will of the Almighty God. Not our idea, it's God's idea. We need to help them. We need to love them enough, be charitable enough to help them come into the one holy Catholic and Apostolic faith. But I want to share with you some of these resources. Let me start by telling you, or quoting for you, a pagan resource of the time. This is a man who lived during this event, 362, 363 AD. Animus Marcellinus. Again, I'm going to link to it, read it for yourself. But he talks about how Julian the Apostate was sort of, apologizing to the Jews. Oh yeah, I know, we sort of destroyed your temple, killed 1 million of your people. It was kind of a big deal, but hey, I'm going to pull out the checkbook. We're going to get this done. We're going to rebuild the thing. We're going to work together. It's going to be awesome. Now, Julian the Apostate, he was trying to take revenge against the Christians. He hated Christianity because Constantine had murdered his family members in order to secure his power, and he was related to Constantine. So Julian the Apostate basically said, if you love Christianity, then I'm going to hate it. And in fact, even though he was raised Catholic, he had himself baptized in bull's blood in a pagan ceremony. He pretended as though he was a pagan monk of sorts. He wore a habit. He set up like 501c3 type of organizations for paganism. He was trying to make paganism great again in the empire. And he saw this as an opportunity. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So let me go support the Jews, and let me go help rebuild that temple, and that will really put a finger in the eye of the Christians. That was the idea. But this Ammonius, I don't know how to say this man's name correctly. It's linked below. Ammonius, he references what happened when Julian the Apostate tried to make this happen. He says, but repeated and alarming outbursts of fireballs near the foundations made it impossible to approach the spot. Some of the workmen were burnt to death, and the obstinate resistance of the fiery element caused the design to be abandoned. So even this non-Christian pagan says he tried but failed miserably. Now here's St. Gregory Nazianzen, also contemporary to this event. He dies in 390 AD. He says in his very long description of this whole encounter, but they being driven against one another, as though by a furious blast of wind, and sudden heaving of the earth. So we're talking earthquakes and tempest here. He goes on, some rushed to one of the neighboring sacred places to pray for mercy. Others, as is wont to happen in such cases, made use of what came to hand to shelter themselves. Others were carried away blindly by the panic and struck against those who stood, who were rushing up to see what was the matter. There are some who say that neither did the sacred place admit them, but that when they approached the folding doors that stood wide open, on coming to them, they found them closed and in their faces by an unseen and invisible power, which works wonders of the sorts of the confusion that impious and the saving of the godly. But what all people nowadays report and believe is that when they were forcing their way and struggling about the entrance, a flame issued from the sacred place and stopped them, and some it burnt up and consumed, so that a fate befell them similar to the disaster of the people of Sodom, or to the miracle of Nadab and Abiud, who offered incense and perished so strangely, whilst others it maimed in the principal parts of their body, so left them for a living monument of God's threatening wrath against sinners. Such then was this event, and let no one disbelieve unless he doubts likewise to the other mighty works of God. But what is yet more strange and more conspicuous, there stood in the heavens a light, circumscribing a cross, and that which before on earth was contemned by the ungodly, both in figure and in name, is now exhibited in heaven, and is made by God a trophy of his victory over the impious, a trophy more lofty than any other. So the sign of the cross was in the sky. So fireballs, earthquake, tempest, people being burned to death, people being maimed, total, utter chaos when they tried to rebuild the temple. St. Ambrose of Milan, who was also someone who lived through this time, St. Ambrose would die in 397 AD, says, have you not heard how when Julian the Apostate, have you not heard how when Julian had ordered the temple of Jerusalem rebuilt, those who were clearing the rubbish were burned by fire from heaven? Are you not afraid that this will happen also now? In fact, you should never have given an order such as Julian would have given. He was saying this to the Emperor Theodosius. So here's one from Rufinus, again, someone contemporary to the time. He says, the bishop, however, and this is the bishop in Jerusalem, the bishop, however, having carefully weighed both what was contained in Daniel's prophecy and the times, and what the Lord had foretold in the Gospels, insisted that the Jews would never be able to put a stone upon a stone. Thus the suspense grew. And behold, on the night which alone remained before the work was to begin, there was a violent earthquake, and not only were the stones for the foundations tossed far and wide, but almost all of the buildings round about were leveled to the ground. The public porticos too, in which the multitude of the Jews staying, who were clearly intent on completing the project, tumbled to the ground, burying all the Jews inside. At daybreak, thinking that it had escaped the misfortune, the remaining multitude had hurried together to look for those who had burned. Now, I'm not going to read the rest. There's a lot more here. I'm going to link to it below for you. But here's the bottom line. You don't want to be on the building committee for the Antichrist. Why was this temple destroyed under God when Julian the Apostate tried to rebuild it in 362, 363 AD? Because the time of the Antichrist was not yet. There were Antichrists in the world, but the Antichrist, the one, had not yet come. And when he does come, the temple will be rebuilt. And that is when God will allow it, because it will usher in the final tribulation, the final time, when through the persecution of the Antichrist, of the faithful, those few remnant faithful that will exist in that time, because your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors, your grown children who've left the church are all going to give apostasy by worshiping the Antichrist in the temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. That's the time God will allow it. Until then, no way, no how. So that's, I think, another warning for us. That God means business. We shouldn't be playing with these things. If you truly want to support the Jews, the Israelis, then support them through loving them enough to share the gospel with them, to help them come into the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the new Israel. This is God's plan for their salvation. And as St. Paul said, what will it mean if through the Jews the destruction of the world comes? What does it mean through their conversion, but the salvation of the world? And Jesus cannot come until they are converted. So we should be about the business of loving them enough to help bringing them into the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Let me know what you think below. God love you. God bless you. And do not be on the building committee of the Antichrist.